Welcome to this virtual meeting of the Sexual Violence Prevention Network. Before we dive in, we have a few housekeeping announcements. For anyone who needs captions, you can turn on the live transcript at the bottom of your screen. And please remember to keep yourself muted anytime you are not speaking during our session today. If you have a question to ask or something to share, please use the chat function. My name is Julia Tyndall. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention Program Planner at the Minnesota Department of Health. It is my pleasure to introduce to you my co-host, Hunter Beckstrom.
Thank you so much, Julia. As Julia just mentioned, I am Hunter Beckstrom. I use he, him, and his pronouns, and I am one of the prevention program coordinators at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MNCASA.
And also on our planning committee are Pogi Del Rosario and Ashley Stirs-Griffith from MNCASA, and Mary Hopkins and Marissa Regay from MDH. Thank you to everyone who helped us to prepare for this meeting today. For those new to these meetings, we host 4 quarterly SVPN meetings per year, and we have 3 goals for these meetings. First, we want to build our collective understanding of primary prevention of sexual violence. Primary prevention refers to the steps that we can take to stop violence from ever happening in the first place. Primary prevention can happen in many different ways, but in SVPN, we like to focus on changes we can make in our communities and as a society.
And our second goal is to share resources related to sexual violence prevention. So you will find resources included in our quarterly meetings, which are recorded and saved on MNCASA's YouTube channel to access after these SVPN meetings. Additionally, we also send out resources, events, and updates on the SVPN mailing list that is hosted by MDH, and that does go out every 2 weeks. MNCASA also shares prevention resources on our prevention email list, and we also encourage you to sign up for updates from the organization called Prevent Connect to stay connected to work that is happening on a national level.
And speaking of connection, that is our third goal for SVPN, which leads us to our icebreaker for today. We want to hear from you in the chat box. Please share your name, your pronouns, and what is one thing you hope to get out of our session today? And Hunter, I'm going to put you on the spot first. What is one thing that you are hoping to get out of our session today?
Absolutely, Julia. Well, I think that we oftentimes, even in the movement, like in my experience, don't typically talk about financial well-being for victims and survivors in the first place. So knowing that we are coupling that conversation along with violence prevention, I'm just super excited for that. So me kind of being a newbie to this conversation, I'm just ready for everything that our wonderful guest speaker has for us today. What about you, Julia?
Oh boy, well, I have seen FreeFrom present before, and these are some of my favorite, and I think are some of the national providers doing some of the coolest work that I see in sexual violence prevention. And I'm really excited about the connection in between economic justice and preventing all sorts of forms of violence and harm. So I'm just kind of a sponge for this information today. And would love to hear from more people in the chat. What is one thing you're hoping to get out of our session? I see Mary says she's looking forward to learning more about FreeFrom, and Catherine is actually working in North Dakota. Welcome. I know that we also have, I believe, partners from Idaho who are in the room as well, who are excited to learn. So excited to see all of you here. And I see also some other thoughts, how we can connect to prevention of sexual violence and financial security as primary prevention, and learning more about strategies for building financial security for victim survivors. Thank you all of you for sharing, and please continue to share in the chat box both your responses to this question and other thoughts that emerge for you doing this presentation today. We want this to be an opportunity for you to meet new people and make connections. This year, MNCASA and MDH have also decided to select a theme for our Sexual Violence Prevention Network quarterly meetings, and that theme is exploring equity.
Absolutely. And our very first presentation that we had done earlier this year in February, we began exploring our theme of exploring equity. And during that meeting, we had started to shed some light on the history behind the advocacy movement by addressing the intersections between oppression and sexual violence, focusing on racial equity, and also hearing some of the untold stories of very pivotal activists and change makers.
And today we're discussing economic justice. And later we'll have Sarah Florman, Public Policy Manager at MnCASA, in to talk about the coerced debt bill currently in the Minnesota legislature. But first, joining us today from the national organization FreeFrom is Sharon Lim. Sharon's presentation is titled Survivor Wealth and Wellness, Financial Security and Violence Prevention. Welcome, Sharon, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. My name is Sharon Lim. I am the Financial Capacity and Trading Manager here at FreeFrom. And really my role here is to talk about financial security as a form of prevention in the work that we do. And I do like to give a little bit of a content warning before we get started, because we are talking about money, we are talking about money trauma. I'm going to be asking some of you to really dive deep into your own experiences. So this may bring up memories, feelings, sensations that aren't always pleasant. So please, at any point, feel free to take care of yourself. Feel free to walk away if you need to. This is being recorded, so you can access it back at any point if needed. And I will say I do use the chat feature. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, feel free to just drop those in, and we will go through these together. Okay. So for the agenda today, a little bit about what we're doing is I'm going to give you a really quick introduction about FreeFrom and the organization that I am a part of. We'll be talking about economic abuse a little bit, and then we'll do a exploring your relationship with money exercise. And here I do want to preface and say, you can engage with this as much or as little as you want, right? So if you feel like this is not the right time for you, that's okay. So just, take that into consideration. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll look at financial security building as a form of prevention, and then creating workspaces that promote staff healing and abundance. So we'll be thinking internally about your own experiences with money, thinking about how do we apply that to your work, and then thinking more broadly about the gender-based violence movement. Okay, so a little bit about FreeFrom. So FreeFrom is a 501c3. We are based in Los Angeles, but we do work nationally, and then we do some work internationally as well. And our work is to envision a world where survivors have sustaining income, savings, and credit with which to build wealth, and the resources to support individual, intergenerational, and community healing. And the way that we do this is, one is we work directly with survivors. We work with them on their safety funds, giving people direct cash access. We work with the gender-based violence movement, training organizations, and then we do a lot of our policy work, working with the state governments, working with federal government, working with banks, employers. And really the goal is to think about a society, a world in which everyone has a part in healing, and it's everyone's responsibility to be able to support survivors in financial healing and building financial wealth. So I'm going to start with a couple of stats about intimate partner violence and financial security, because I do recognize that sometimes this is a new topic for a lot of people. And when we think about abuse, financial abuse is not always top of mind. So a little bit about a quick stats is people who have survived intimate partner violence incur an average of almost or over about $52,242 in lost wages over a lifetime. So this is just talking about lost wages in terms of money lost with a job. The lifetime cost of an intimate partner violence, including the cost of healthcare problems, lost productivity, and criminal justice costs, is over $100,000 for women and about $23,000 for men. And we unfortunately do not have stats on people who are transgender or non-binary. But if you just take these numbers at face value, it's over $100,000 in lost costs for women alone for experiencing IPV. So it really is so incredibly expensive to experience violence and to be subjected to violence. We know that 1 in 4 cis women and 1 in 2 trans folks in the United States will be subjected to IPV in their lifetime. So if we think about this stat of 1 in 4 cis women and 1 in 2 trans folks, and we take that with the previous stat of over $100,000 in lost costs for women, this shows incredibly how many women and how many trans folks are experiencing such an expensive toll on their financial capacity and on their financial lives. And what we know about economic abuse is that 99% of survivors report experiencing economic abuse. So let's go back, way back, and think about what is economic abuse, right? So financial or economic abuse occurs when a harm doer exerts or maintains control over a survivor's financial resources in order to render the survivor financially dependent on the harm doer. So the thing with money is that it's deeply personal and it's deeply cultural and it's familial. And there are things that we learn from our childhoods and from our communities and from our cultures and from our families that may sometimes feel normal, and maybe they are, and other times they feel normal, but maybe they show or are indicative of economic abuse. So when we think about what does that actually look like? So economic harm, I will say, can be done in relationships, in workplaces, in government. There's a lot of places where economic harm exists, but for this particular presentation, we're going to be looking specifically at relationships. And this, I don't mean relationships in a romantic way, but I'm thinking romantic, familial, friends, strangers, anything that is interpersonal. So, but it often does stem from a partner or a family member. So economic abuse can take many forms, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some ways that we have seen examples of economic harm happening with other folks has been preventing a person from obtaining or maintaining employment. So telling a person that they cannot work or making it so difficult for them to work. Maybe it's harassing them at their job. Maybe it is making it so that they are unable to attend their job regularly and they get let go. So it's really messing with someone's ability to create an income. Another form can be taking a person's paycheck and or putting them on an allowance. So oftentimes people do work, but they don't see that paycheck. They are often giving that paycheck, giving the control over that paycheck to someone else, and they are put on an allowance, maybe a monthly allowance, maybe a weekly allowance, but there's a control over that money. Another thing that we have seen is heavily monitoring spending. So it can be asking questions like, what are you spending the money on? How much did you spend? Let me see your receipts, those kinds of questions. Something that we see that is really, really common and so devastating is taking out credit cards or loans in someone else's name and saddling them with debt. And oftentimes what that happens is either one, if the person is not in a marriage and they are not getting divorced, then there really is not a ton of reparations that a person can obtain because it is, our laws are just not there, right? So we see that a lot where a survivor will come to us and say, you know, my ex-partner or my family member took out hundreds or tens of thousands of dollars in debt and they won't pay it back, and it's just all in my name. Damaging a person's credit, that relates back to the credit card. It can relate to if someone co-signed for a loan and they refuse to pay for that loan. Maybe it's an auto loan, a personal loan. And that is incredibly damaging because in the United States, a person's credit is really dictates how much personal capital that they are able to gain from the banks, from other credit unions. And then the other thing that we see in economic harm is withholding necessary personal identification or financial documents. So not letting the survivors see the bank accounts, not letting them have access to forms that maybe they need to open the bank account, all those kinds of stuff. So again, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are some aspects of economic harm in relationships. And it's just good to think about what it looks like, maybe as you're talking to people, as you're thinking of prevention, as you're looking at your own lives and the ones in your communities. Okay. Do we have any questions here about any economic harm about the stats before we move into our exercise? Okay. So we are going to be moving into an exploring your relationship with money exercise. Again, you are welcome to engage with this as much or as little as you want. The reason we do this exercise is it's really hard to talk about money with other people when you're feeling really uncomfortable doing it. And that's not to say that you have to talk about your own personal finances, or to say that you have to know exactly that your own personal finances have to be, on point in order for you to talk about finances with others as a form of prevention. But it is helpful to really set the tone for how you engage with money, how you talk about money, and where your relationship with money currently is. So with that said, we are going to go through this exercise. There is an opportunity to share at the end, but completely optional. You do not have to share if you do not want to, but there is an option to share if you would like to. Okay, so the first question I have, and you can do this, on your phone, you can do this on pencil and paper, you can do this, typing it, it's totally up to you. So the first question that I start with is, what is your earliest childhood money memory? Your earliest childhood money memory. And think about who is or are the adults you associate with that memory. And think about a money memory from your teenage years. And what were the emotions associated with that event then? And how do you feel about it now, looking back as an adult? And then think about your money memory from your young adulthood. And what makes this memory significant to you? And then think about a money memory from the last few years. And think about what are the emotions that come up for you around that money memory. Okay, so I would love to hear from people maybe in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, that works too. How has your money story changed throughout the years? So when you think about your money memory from your early childhood to your young adult years, to the last several years, how has your money story changed? Or how has it stayed the same?
I can jump in briefly, Sharon, and just share my experience, knowing that I feel like it's been quite consistent from when I was younger up until now, but always knowing that like coming from a space of like scarcity, like even knowing that like I'm a very privileged person and my family has like been able to pay for things, but we can never really do anything extravagant necessarily. Like I remember growing up and like going to friends' houses and like they always had the best snacks. And like, why don't we have the cool snacks at home and things like that? And so just trying to be aware of like trying to understand the context and people's lived experiences are just so drastically different, but knowing that I feel like scarcity is probably a very common theme for a lot of folks too.
Most definitely. Thank you for sharing, Hunter. Yeah, I think a lot of times in our childhoods, it starts with, who has the best snacks. And then in teenage years, it goes to who has the best phone or the car. And then as we get older, it's really thinking about who went on the best vacation or who has the best home. So definitely there is a lot of scarcity mentality around it, especially when you work with survivors and when there is a lot of hardship around. But I think it really comes down to, it doesn't always have to be the case, right? The way that we talk to survivors, the way that we talk to ourselves. There is maybe a different way that we can shift. Thank you for sharing, Javi and Jen. I'm going to read it for our interpreter. Javi shared, now I feel it depends on me. When I was little and a teen, my parents gave it to me. And what Jen shared, my family was very poor and always struggled. I vowed to be different, but now my ex-husband spent all of the money we had. Only in the last 4 years, I now have lots of money in savings and can afford to take vacations. I am financially stable and comfortable. I love that. Thank you for sharing, Jen. And Poggy shared, my dad was an accountant, but through my childhood, he never wanted me to have an allowance, and eventually he didn't let me get a job during high school. So I really didn't know how to manage my finances until I became an adult. And I think that's such a common thing at least in the United States that I've experienced is if we do not learn money from our parents, there really is no other place to learn money from, right? It's oftentimes not taught in schools. For those of us who went to college, it's not taught there either. And so we become these adults who we think we should know how to manage our money. And we think we should know all of these things about finances, but how, right? Where do we learn these things from? Okay, thank you everyone so much for sharing. Oh, Javi, did you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it really depends on culture too. For example, where I used to live, I'm from Chile, and I remember if your parents allowed you to work when you're a teenager, it was because you needed to. It's not like here that it's so common that teenagers will work. For us, it was like, no, you don't need to. And then I was like, but you're not giving, I want to buy silly stuff. And they were like, no, you don't need it. So then I couldn't even, like, they wouldn't give me the money that I wanted, but I couldn't even work either because it was like others would think that my parents didn't make enough to give me what I needed. So yeah, it's cultural too.
Definitely. Yeah, I think money is cultural, it's personal, familial. There's so many things that society tells us about our culture and about money. And that's why money is so complicated and it's really hard to talk to with other people. Okay. I want everyone to just think about it, and you can share in the chat if you want. What surprises you about your money story? What are you proud of? And what do you want to heal? So, for people who have, John, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. When you're talking about how in the last 4 years, you can now have a lot of money in the savings and can afford to take vacations. Oh, I think that's something to be really, really proud of, right? And for those of us who have a little bit of harm or, however you want to take it in your money story, there are places where we can heal, and just knowing that that is a possibility for us. Okay. So I would love to hear from other people in the chat if you want to share other opportunities to share. What stage of your life has the strongest memories of money and the greatest emotions attached to them, and why do you think that is? what were your initial 3 words when you think about money? What surprises you about your money story? What are you proud of? What do you want to heal? And this is one of my favorite questions that I love asking people is describe what financial freedom looks like for you. And even if you don't want to share, I would just highly recommend that everyone just think about what financial freedom looks like for yourself.
I can share. I'm just thinking the stages of life. I think the ones that come to my mind are the ones that I didn't have enough money, but at the same time, it was exciting to get a little at least. So for example, like when I just started working, I didn't have enough. I mean, I didn't have much, but it was much more than before that I didn't have any. So it was exciting, and that brings me those memories of kind of thinking of money because I needed it, but I didn't have it, and then I had some. And I think for me, one of my biggest memories is when I learned that it's a good idea to separate like savings, donations, and spending, because donations wasn't something that I had budgeted kind of. And I think it's very important. And I also started teaching that to my kids. So just kind of learning this new way of separating things. I always saved, but I never thought about the donating part as as another item. And I think that's very important too. And I think that has been the biggest change I've had in my life. And then about financial freedom, I think it is not depending on anyone to make the money you need to make. So it really depends on you, and that's very hard because sometimes you have the capabilities, but you're not gonna get paid what you need to get paid, right? So, but at least it doesn't depend on other people. I think it's being able to pay or to manage your money yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. Okay. We're going to take a quick break. Let's take a 9-minute break. It's 11:31 for me. So let's take a 9-minute break for whatever time zone you're in and come back at the 40-minute mark. And I will be, around. So if you want to chat me, that works too. And so after the break, we'll be talking more concretely about what are some of the strategies that you can employ as in your work as a preventionist after knowing your relationship with money, and then thinking more broadly about the gender-based violence movement and financial security and how we can obtain that in the movement as well. Okay, I'll see you in 9 minutes, everyone. Give me a 1 in the chat just to let me know you're back, maybe an emoji. Just letting me know that you're back. That would be helpful. Okay, thanks. Love it. I love the enthusiasm, Pam. Okay. And then, so now that we have gone through our relationship with money, and I do want to say, I know maybe a lot of us weren't expecting to go into our own relationship with money. So, if you need to take a break, totally fine. If you need to send me an email with your thoughts, would welcome those as well. So financial security building as a form of prevention. So thinking about how do we look at financial security building as a form of prevention in the work that you do. So financial insecurity is the #1 reason why people who have experienced GBV return to an abusive relationship or enter into a new abusive relationship. So it's really thinking about people who are thinking about, how do I feed myself? How do I feed my children? What are the options that people have. And when people have limited financial options, they have limited life options. So oftentimes it's not a financial choice, it's a life choice that people are making when they're thinking about their own relationships. So what can you do in your role to prevent it, right? What can you do as a preventionist? So the first thing that I always say is you normalize conversations about finances and you create the spaces for those conversations and questions. So when you're in your communities, when you're talking and having these trainings with folks, you want to be able to talk about finances in a way that is comfortable for you and is not triggering for you, but is also comforting for the person that you're talking to. We know this from our exercise. We know this from a personal experience. Talking about money is awkward. It's hard. It's weird. And so we want to be able to normalize these conversations because there really isn't anything bad about talking about money. It's just the experiences that we've had around it, excuse me. Okay, so thinking about why do we fear or avoid financial conversations? Sometimes it may feel too personal. There may be cultural beliefs around money. Maybe we get potentially retaliated by a person or a workplace or an institution if we talk about money. There may be a risk of economic abuse or harm. Maybe the person that we're talking to, has a different viewpoint about money in society, and so we don't want to delve into that conversation. But it may also be that we have our own financial traumas around money and harms around money that we haven't processed yet and aren't able to have a conversation about. And so those are the reasons why we avoid financial conversations. But then what are we missing when we avoid talking about money, right? So when you're going out into these communities and talking about violence prevention and we're not mentioning money, what are the things that we miss? We miss maybe economic abuse that can go unnoticed or can get worse. We maybe miss something that if we had said something to somebody in the community, maybe they would have thought about their own relationship with money a little bit differently. Inequalities around money and power can go unnoticed and unchecked. And really the thing that I harp on a lot is we lose opportunities for economic growth for the people in the communities that are being harmed. And that's really one of the reasons that I think is so important, especially as people who are in violence prevention, to talk about money, because when you're able to talk about money in a way that feels safe and doesn't feel judgmental, there's a lot of opportunities there for movement. And then we also get into financial autonomy, right? When we're able to talk about money, it allows people to have the ability to make their own decisions, gives people access to their own money. What we want is for people to feel confident when it comes to their money. So often people and survivors are told, well, you're just not good with it. Like, I handle the finances in this relationship and you just get to, bring home the paycheck or not work, right? And so we want people to feel confident about where they are when it comes to their money. We want people to be able to financially recuperate when something does happen. And then we want people to be able to trust themselves when it comes to their money and being trusted with their money. And this comes really important when we're talking about their relationship with the gender-based violence movement. Another thing that you can do when you are thinking about your role as a preventionist is to incorporate financial capacity building and economic abuse into your trainings, into the trainings that you're doing in your communities. And so what does that look like, right? What does financial capacity building and economic abuse look like when you're talking about it in your trainings? And a way that's really simple that you can kind of just incorporate into your current trainings or your presentations that you do is thinking about this survivor economic experience economic model. And it's really thinking about, if you present this to a survivor, to a group of survivors, or to a community center, is thinking about where are you in this movement in the experience model. And this helps people, one, identify where they are in their experience model, and two, identify where they want to be and where they need to be in order to find that healing. So this is one slide that you can just pull and copy that is really helpful when you're thinking about what is the first step that I can take when I'm thinking about financial capacity. So the two things I would say is, one, talk about the stats, talk about what does economic harm look like. And it's pretty simple, right? What is economic harm? And two, share this slide of the survivor economic experience model. And then 3, similarly, is to provide trainings and education around economic abuse as well as financial safety planning. The safety planning section is so important because you don't want to leave people with like, this is economic abuse, and then not leave them with the, now what do I do about it? So if you're talking about economic abuse, here are some things that you can pull out and share in your slides. So you can talk about what is economic abuse, what are some examples of economic abuse, what are some effects of economic abuse, and what are some resources that survivors can get access to. And if you are creating these trainings and you have questions for, FreeFrom on, does this look right? Is this, does this make sense? Feel free to send those over. We're happy to take a look. And then the other part of incorporating things into your training for violence prevention is thinking about a financial safety plan. So a financial safety plan is thinking about a couple different things. It's looking at your financial landscape, so determining what monies, debts, and vulnerabilities you have. And the important part here is the vulnerabilities where someone might be easily able to harm you financially, because that's where we can safety plan for and think about what are some ways that we can protect ourselves from those vulnerabilities. Okay, so I'm going to move through some of our vulnerabilities. Okay. I have some slides on how you can do your financial landscape, but because we are short on time, I'm going to skip over those. But you will all have a copy of this PowerPoint, so it will be available to you to go through more with more detail on documents, on banking, assets, credit, online, and if you have any questions on these, feel free to email me. Another way that you can think about financial prevention is doing outreach and offering trainings to non-traditional institutions such as banks and employers. And this sounds kind of weird because they're not part of the gender-based violence movement, but we are thinking about how do we create a society in violence prevention, and it's not just gender-based violence organizations. So trainings for banks that you can do is Economic Abuse 101. So many bankers and tellers don't know what economic abuse is despite working in the financial sector. And so this is a really easy way to kind of get them into the role of supporting survivors, because a lot of survivors are unbanked or underbanked or are being harmed through banks. You can also share what is gender-based violence and how does it affect survivors who are bankers. So people who are banking at their institutions, how does being a survivor affect them? You can do a training on how do you spot financial abuse, and we have a whole PDF resource guide on it. So if you are interested in providing that training, let us know, and we are happy to share those with you. And then you can think about how do you better support survivors who are customers. So when you're thinking about trainings for banks, it may honestly just be a conversation with someone in their community relations department, thinking about what are the things that you're doing for survivors who are your customers. You're missing this huge subset of customers who are survivors who are being underbanked or unbanked because they are being harmed. And so how do we bring those people into the fold? And then you can also do trainings for employers as well. So we're talking about the employers maybe who are local to your organization, who are local to your community. And when we think about the employers who are employing survivors, we want to think about, one, what is economic abuse and how can they as employers spot that? So if you have a survivor whose partner is calling them constantly, that is a form of harassment and economic harm, because that may be affecting with their workplace. So you can also do trainings on what is gender-based violence and domestic violence and how does that affect survivors. You can think about survivor-centered workplace policies, which is what we will get into next. And then we can also think about how do you better support, recruit, or retain survivors. And if you have any questions on, what do these trainings actually look like and what are the slides that I can share, again, please feel free to email us and I'm happy to share those. Okay, and then the last thing I will say around healing with violence prevention is to continue your own healing around money. The more comfortable you can get around talking about money, the more comfortable it will be for the person who is listening to you. So that's not to say that you have to go and share your personal stories around money at all. But the more that we can feel confident and feel abundant around their own money stories, the more it will be easier to be able to talk about money with other people, especially in the public setting. And then explore areas around your workplace where there may be opportunities for economic healing. The gender-based violence movement has a lot of places for opportunities for healing, for economic healing, for the survivors who work in it, for the people who work in it. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about for the next couple minutes. And again, at any point, if you have any questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat. Okay, so creating a movement that promotes staff healing and abundance. And so you may be asking, why are we talking about this when we're talking about violence prevention, right? And the way that we look at it at FreeFrom is that the work starts internally. The work when we talk about violence prevention is not just about going out into the communities and thinking about financial services as a form of prevention, but really thinking internally about what is it that we're doing in the movement and how do we start from the movement so that we can think about prevention in a way that is with the economic lens. So economic harm by workplaces. Remember in a couple of slides ago, we talked about economic harm between relationships, and we mentioned how, economic harm is not just interpersonal. So there are ways that workplaces, including those in the gender-based violence movement, can harm survivors and other people. So it can be not providing livable wages or any wages at all. It can be not providing adequate benefits, withholding paychecks. This can be overworking employees without proper pay, where we see this a lot in the gender-based violence movement, is people who work overtime or people who are on call without being properly compensated. This can be withholding necessary tax information, reducing benefits or salary without notice, lack of protective leave, or high levels of salary or wage disparities in an organization. And so the reason that we talk about economic harm in the workplace is that if we don't understand our own beliefs and practices around money, we may unintentionally cause harm to coworkers and the folks that we set out to support. And that's why the money exercise is so important, right? We have to think about what is my own practices? What are the things that I've learned, and that the things that I want to unlearn, because I don't want to cause harm to my coworkers, because I don't want to cause harm to the clients, because I don't want to cause harm to my community. Like most forms of violence, economic abuse is a learned behavior that we may have accidentally adopted or normalized. And without a critical and honest exploration of our own money story, the economic harm that we endured may go unnoticed or unhealed, and the economic harm that we may have perpetrated may go unchecked or unresolved. Economic harm is difficult because, and just like any harm, anyone can be a perpetrator, right? Anyone can have caused economic harm, and we may have, because of the things that we have learned, because of the things that we may have internalized. And so especially with ourselves, with our communities, in our workplaces, we want to be able to identify what those things are and being able to resolve it. So healing economic trauma in the workplace. So you want to be able to continue to explore your relationship with money and how it shows up in the workplace. Identify times when you have personally in the current or past workplaces where you felt like you were economically harmed. And what would the ideal situation have looked like? And are there times in your workplaces where you may have harmed a colleague or a staff or a client or a community member? And where was that behavior learned, and how do you remedy it? And this is not a place for like judgment or to think about like, oh, this is when, so-and-so said this to me and I felt bad about it. It's really thinking about if that did happen and when that did happen, what would you have liked to see? Right? There's a lot of us who have experienced economic harm in the workplace, myself included. And so thinking about what is the ideal situation for that? And then for places where we may have caused harm, where did we learn that from? Okay, I'm going to keep going because we are limited on time. Okay, so I'm going to go into why is this important on the GBV movement. So what we know is that 55.3% of service providers identify as survivors. So 55.3% of the people who are working in the gender-based violence movement identify as survivors themselves. Knowing that almost about a little over half, we also know that 1 in 4 staff who identify as survivors still report being in contact with their harm doers, and 1 in 5 staff members do not feel completely safe at home. So that's the staff that we have in the movement, right? We have survivors who work in the movement. And what we know is that in Minneapolis, the average salary of a service provider working in the gender-based violence movement is about $40K a year. And according to the MIT living wage calculator, a living wage for one adult with one child in Minneapolis is $37 per hour, which is about $77,000 pre-tax. So that's a really big disparity. So if we go back to the numbers of about 55% of service providers identify as survivors, we know that being a survivor is extremely expensive at $100 grand, over $100 grand for the female survivors. Then we know that the gender-based violence movement, and this is countrywide, like countrywide across the United States, are not being paid enough for healing, let alone having a living wage, right? This is just what we understand. And the reason I talk about this is because prioritizing financial security in the movement begins with acknowledging the high rates of survivorship and financial insecurity among staff and meaningfully investing in their well-being. So I think it's really such a hard and high bar to ask people who are working in the movement, who are being underpaid, who are not being paid a living wage, to be able to say, I want you to go out and talk about financial security and as a form of prevention when we ourselves are not being paid a living wage, right? When we ourselves are not being acknowledged for the work that we're doing and thinking about the survivors who are working in our movement. Okay, I know that was a lot. So I want to pause here for reflections and questions. I know we sped through a lot of it because we are limited on time, but here, do we have any questions, any reflections, anything that I can answer, any slides that you would like me to go back to?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Sharon, and I'll give some other folks some time to think, but I did have a question for you. So I know that you had advocated for kind of working with your local banks or other employers as well. Has there been any kind of, unique buy-in strategies that FreeFrom has utilized to kind of incentivize that? Because I know that some organizations might not unfortunately be interested in such training. So is there any type of like really awesome strategies that you all might have used to do that?
Yeah, so what we've experienced is I've had a lot of organizations reach out to me and say, we have a relationship with our local bank. And it's usually a credit union because credit unions are more local, they're smaller, they don't have as much bureaucracy. And so what we've noticed is that people will come to us and say, we have a relationship with our local credit union, but the credit union is not well-versed in gender-based violence issues, and it's not well-versed in being able to talk to survivors. Oftentimes what happens is organizations will bring in banks and credit unions and these quote unquote financial experts, and these financial experts are talking about, retirement and 50 and these big kind of accounts that a lot of survivors are feeling kind of like, what are you talking about? I'm just trying to like make next week's meal or tomorrow's bus ride. And so what I recommend is that I think it's completely great to make a relationship with your credit union. Where I would hesitate is to only see them as the expert. See yourself as the expert as well, right? There's a lot that you and your organization can provide so that you can work with your credit union. And one of the things that you had mentioned, Hunter, is thinking about like, how do we, like, what are the, like, why would they want to do that, right? And so the way that I think about that is, one, survivors are incredibly underbanked and unbanked. So survivors are being underbanked and that they don't utilize, and underbanked and unbanked means they don't utilize banking products, they don't use banking accounts, and a lot of credit unions want people to use their services, right? That's how they're still a business. And so maybe a way that you can think about it is if you put, and the way that you can approach a bank is if you put these, guidelines in place, or if you take these trainings, if your tellers take these 4 trainings, then we as an organization will comfortably be able to direct our staff or our clients to you, to bank with you. If you can, commit to all of your tellers taking a training on gender-based violence and how to spot financial abuse, then we will say that we will recommend our clients go to you, because we know that you are more survivor friendly than, the local Bank of America down the street or something like that. So that's really the way that I've seen it, is you have to give something to get something at the end of the day. And people want more, banks want more people who are banking with them, but you can't send your clients if the banks are not going to be survivor friendly. And then another way is there's a lot of fraud that happens in bank accounts with economic harm. And so really it's to the bank's benefit that people are not being harmed. It's to their benefit that they are being able to catching those things early.
Sharon, thank you for that. And Hunter, thanks for your comment and questions. One of the reflections that's coming up for me as we're having this discussion is that this could be a really important opportunity to connect with our partners in elder justice. I feel like I've heard a lot of stories about bankers and bank tellers having training on how to recognize economic abuse among elders. It's like a standard, I think, for a lot of people with, and I know that our partners, the Elder Justice Center, have done a lot of work around this. And it's just so interesting to me to think that, somebody might see a red flag with the way that, say, an adult is maybe engaged in specific or in suspicious, I guess, activity by taking large monies out of an elder's bank account. But it just doesn't feel like we have that same awareness or thoughtfulness around economic justice for domestic violence more broadly. So that feels like a connection opportunity. And I want to highlight a question that Catherine had in the chat, which is, what's an example of the guidelines that you recommend banks and credit unions implement?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And excuse my typing because I was looking for these banking guidelines. So I put in the chat of our FreeFrom banking guidelines. And this is a really good, guide for you to think about what our guidelines are and sending those to the banking partners if you do have any. Specifically, we're thinking about, if you want to think about pages 14 through 15, and some of these guidelines are offering accounts that meet the bank on national standards, and you can read more of those standards in the link. Keeping people's contact information confidential and secure, and believe it or not, a lot of these banks do not. Implementing fraud protections on survivor accounts, opening safety accounts for survivors, designating an internal team that is specializing in survivors and survivor accounts, allowing survivors to open IDs or bank accounts with IDs and alternate addresses, because a lot of times home is not the safe place for them. And so there's, you can read all about these guidelines and more details in the slides below. But this is a really good presentation to start with if you're thinking about, partnering with your local bank. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to put my email in the chat so that if you have a question, you can reach out to me. And then in closing, I do like to kind of take a minute to think about, anything that came up today. I personally like to just sit with it and, think about what came up for me. What are the things that, I've done this training so many times, but each time there's something new that comes up. So really just sit with it, think about what that means to you. Take a couple of deep breaths. I know we moved through this information really quickly, and so we are going to be sharing the slides after, so you can take a look at that. And then please feel free to email me at any point if you have any questions, if you want to run your slides by me. Feel free to stay connected with us on social media. And I will hand it back to Julia.
Wow, Sharon, thank you so much for this presentation. I just am, as I'm sitting here, sitting with my thoughts and feelings from today, I was just really kind of surprised by the emotions that it brought up. And this is definitely one that I am going to have to rewatch and revisit those slides. And I just want to highlight that the FreeFrom website and that FreeFrom as an organization are just an absolutely amazing organization doing incredible and deeply important work. And I'm hopeful that we'll see some cool things come out of Minnesota in the future. So thank you, Sharon.
Yes, and I really couldn't agree more. Thank you again so much. I was just taking a real quick moment to look at some of the slides from that report that you had just shared in the chat too. And that looks incredibly very tangible and very clear next steps that it's going to be very applicable for anyone wanting to kind of continue on with this work. So again, thank you so very much, Sharon. Well, with that, I did want to kind of transition and segue into our next little piece of the meeting here today. And in order to do that, just actually wanted to share one of the statistics from FreeFrom's report called Before and Beyond Crisis. And in that report, folks had mentioned that harm doers have incurred an average of $5,452 in coerced and fraudulent debt in survivors' names. And so with that, here in Minnesota, MNCASA has been supporting bills on coerced debt this legislative session. And so here to give us a quick update on some of those efforts is Sarah Florman. And Sarah is the public policy manager here at MNCASA. And Sarah leads MNCASA's policy work to advocate for change at the local, state, and national levels. And she works with members, victims, and survivors, community stakeholders, and lawmakers to address issues affecting victims and survivors of sexual violence, and also working towards fulfilling our organization's mission of driving transformative culture change. So with that, if we can give a little welcome or round of applause to Sarah, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Hunter. This has been a really interesting presentation, and it definitely brings up a lot. I think financial issues are traumatizing under almost all circumstances at certain points in your life. Today, I'm going to give you an update specifically on some things that are happening around coerced debt, which is one kind of specific form of economic abuse. So I think a lot of this was covered in terms of definitions, but just to say it again, coerced debt is debt that an abusive partner has taken out in the victim survivor's name without that person's knowledge, or it can be debt taken out by the victim survivor under force or threat from an abusive partner. There are some states that have passed civil laws to help folks remove coerced debt from credit reports or to eliminate their liability for that debt. So this past summer, MNCASA, Standpoint, and the Legal Services Advocacy Project, as well as Violence Free Minnesota, all got together, and we were talking about coerced debt as being something that was happening in our state, that's happening with both sex and labor trafficking, as well as domestic abuse situations and intimate partner violence. And we decided to attempt to create some legislation to provide one of these civil remedies. So that is happening as we speak. The bill that I'm going to describe to you really quickly is currently this is the part where we talk about the legislature, and I try not to be confusing. The coerced debt bill was included in the omnibus bills, the commerce omnibus bills in the House and Senate. The Commerce Conference Committee got together and kind of looked at their two omnibus bills and reconciled them to form an agreement, which is called the Conference Committee Report. They are finalizing that report, I believe today, and it will then be going to the House and Senate floors for one more vote before it is passed. The coerced debt language is in that conference committee report. So we are really close to the finish line with this. And what we've done is we've defined coerced debt. We have defined, what a creditor is. We've defined the types of documentation that we'll be talking about. But what we've really tried to do here is to provide an opportunity for someone who has accrued coerced debt to be able to petition to have that debt removed from their credit report and to no longer be liable for payment of that debt. So there are kind of a bunch of different clauses and definitions. The biggest question has been, how does one go about proving that? How do you go about proving that you've had this coerced debt, that you're, the debt on your credit report is something that that was coerced? Because to speak to what Sharon, excuse my cat, was saying earlier, creditors and banks aren't really well versed in this stuff, at least as of now. So one of the things that we were looking at was what are kind of some ways that we can have victim survivors be able to document or demonstrate that they've got this coerced debt without kind of re-traumatizing further. So there's a few different methods, one of which is going to be basically the sworn certification from a qualified third-party professional. And those folks could be domestic abuse advocates, sexual assault counselors, healthcare providers, mental health care providers, social workers, marriage and family therapists, or nonprofits that work with victims of domestic and sexual abuse or sex and labor trafficking. So there is just the ability to provide a written certification saying this person is the victim of coerced debt. This debt should be erased. If you want to see the specific language, I'm going to drop a file in the chat here. It is a several hundred page report, and that is the conference committee report. The language about coerced debt starts on line 155.24. So if you're really interested in reading about it, it starts there. It goes on for a few pages, but it talks both about what this coerced debt is and what those, what the different kind of relief options are, as well as sort of reinforcing, by the way, it's not okay to do this. FYI, it's not okay to take out debt in another person's name or to force or coerce someone into doing that. And then it does provide some opportunities for banks and creditors to go after the abuser to get that money. So all of the folks who'd been working on this, primarily the folks at Legal Services Advocacy Project, spent the last several months working with banks and credit unions to make sure that we were going to be able to get language that was helpful, a bill that would actually work for folks and do some good, that was also not going to be blocked or objected to by the major financial institutions who obviously are going to be really focused on finding ways to get their money. So we think we've come up with something that's really good. It's not perfect because nothing is, but it is definitely a step in the right direction to remedying some of the economic abuse that folks in Minnesota are seeing. And I can take, that's kind of all I have about that. I can take questions if folks have them. It's not a very exciting bill unless you're working directly with folks, or if you are someone who has experienced this. I think it's probably a wonderful change and something that we're really excited about doing in Minnesota.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, Sarah, for just offering a little background on some of the current bills that are going on. I will just leave it open just for a little bit more to see if anyone does have any specific questions too.
I'm just reflecting how wonderful and how important it is that we have people who are working on all different sides of economic justice, that we have legislative advocacy happening, and that we have opportunities for advocates to provide direct services and preventative services. And I just want to applaud you, Sarah, and say thank you. And thank you to your colleagues and others who have invested in this important work. I think it is a really powerful thing to see after Sharon's presentation, to see what it could look like for change to happen in Minnesota.
Yes, agreed. And Sarah, if you are comfortable, if you wanted to share your contact information in the chat in case anyone wanted to reach out to you to speak about that further too. Thank you so much again. And so as we're kind of narrowing down to the end of our meeting today, as always, we kind of finish up with some announcements that we wanted to share out. And so first and foremost, we would encourage you to please save the date for our next Sexual Violence Prevention Network meeting. And so that is currently scheduled for Monday, August 14th from 1 to 2:30. And while we still don't have a topic figured out quite yet, it is going to be announced very shortly, but please know that we are going to continue on with our theme here in 2023 about embracing equity.
There are also a few exciting conferences coming up. The Minnesota Office of Higher Education is hosting a Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Summit, a two-day workshop designed for Minnesota campus leaders, prevention specialists, Title IX coordinators, and other professionals involved in the sexual misconduct process on campus. The event will be taking place June 12th to 13th in St. Cloud. Registration is free, but space is limited, so make sure that you register soon. Poggi has just posted that link for more information in the chat. I'm really excited. I'll be there. I know that Hunter has been helping with the planning process, and excited to see it come to fruition.
Yes, very excited for that to be happening pretty soon. And additionally, wanted to share out that registration for the 2023 National Sexual Assault Conference has just opened. I think it was actually just today that it had dropped. And so the theme for this year's conference is Equity in Action, and the conference is going to be held in person in San Francisco in California, and that is going to be between August 22nd and the 24th. And so Poggi should be, yep, thank you so much, Poggi, for sharing that in the chat. And so, yeah, please try to attend that conference. I've only attended it virtually, but it's been fantastic the last couple of years for sure.
Yeah, we'll have to have a meetup in California or something of anybody from Minnesota who makes it out. And we would love to hear from all of you. What events or new resources or other items might you want to share with the group? Please feel free to put those announcements in the chat or unmute yourself and share aloud. I'm not seeing anything yet, and I'm not seeing anybody unmute. There's still time though, but maybe we can move into our evaluation question while we wait and see if anybody has anything to share.
Yes, thank you, Julia. So we do have one poll question. I am going to launch it here in just a moment. So it should have popped up on your screen for you. And this is really just to ensure that hopefully we can improve the experience for you in the future for these SVPN meetings. And so asking overall, this meeting helped me, and you can select one or more of these choices if you want. And so the first option is gain knowledge about primary prevention of sexual violence, gain knowledge about economic justice, gain knowledge about this legislative session's coercive debt bills, learn about a resource, identify someone to connect with, think of an action I can take based on what was discussed, and then other. And if you do select other, would love to have you share it in the chat if you are comfortable. All right, we'll just leave the poll open for about 10 or 15 more seconds. Thank you everyone who has voted so far.
And we would also love for you to take a moment to share in the chat box any suggestions or requests you have for future SVPN quarterly meetings, especially if you have ideas of ways that we can build on our theme for 2023 of embracing equity. You can also send suggestions to me or to Hunter, and we'll put our contact information in the chat as well.
All right. Well, with that, just want to say thank you so much to everyone who has joined us today for the Sexual Violence Prevention Network meeting. I want to give special thanks to Sharon and Sarah and for our ASL interpreters as well. And we really hope to see you for our next SVPN, which is going to be in August. Thank you again so much, everyone.